Until very recently, there were 3 communities in New York City that handled more than 75% of the waste. Not because they wanted to, but because they were poor communities, they were Black communities, they were communities without political influence. A couple of things I noticed growing up in the steel town was who lived in the areas where there was all the pollution. And it was, quite frankly, very few people who looked like me and a lot of people who were people of color and new immigrants to the country, and they were living in the neighborhoods that were most impacted. But they weren't the ones who could work at the steel. We called it the steel. Almost all of the jobs at the steel went to white men. And that disconnect between who had to bear the burdens of the pollution associated with this economically productive activity versus who got the benefits of it really shaped the way I think about the world. We look at the world as a series of things to be extracted and consumed and then discarded, as opposed to viewing ourselves as part of an ecosystem that exists independent of us and hopefully will exist for our children and their children and their children. If it can happen in New York, it can happen anywhere.
What is the solution really? Welcome to Compassiviste Dialogues. I'm your host, Ali Horiat. My goal in this program is to educate our audience about various global issues and how we can help. My guest today is Rebecca Bratspies, a distinguished scholar in environmental justice, human rights, and environmental law. She teaches at the City University of New York School of Law, where she founded the Center for Urban Environmental Reform. Beyond academia, Professor Bratspies has authored award-winning works, including the graphic novel series, The Environmental Justice Chronicles, and the insightful book naming Gotham, the villains, rogues, and heroes behind New York place names. Her innovative approach combines rigorous scholarship with creative storytelling to engage diverse audiences on pressing environmental and social issues. Rebecca, hello, and welcome to Compassiviste Dialogues.
Hi, thank you so much for that very generous introduction. I'm delighted to be here.
Great. I want to start. I usually do this with really interesting people because I want to know what made them who they are. So I want to start with a much younger Rebecca. Did you, at 4 or 6, you probably didn't want to be involved with environmental law, maybe social causes, but not so deeply in one strand. So what were the mentors or experiences that sparked the passion from, whatever you wanted to be as a child, all the way to what you're doing now and being such an advocate for it?
That's an interesting question. So my parents were very socially engaged people, and they still are. They're in their 80s now, but they still are deeply, not enmeshed, but rooted in their communities, and they view themselves as people who have a responsibility to the wider world. And that was a message they passed on to me and to my siblings. And when I was a very small child, they took me to an Earth Day celebration. And they explained to me about the idea of ecology and the idea of protecting the earth and protecting the birds and the trees. I was little. And it really, really, really struck a chord. And as I got older, I grew up in a steel town. And there was a tremendous amount of pollution. And a couple of things I noticed growing up in the steel town was who lived in the areas where there was all the pollution. And it was, quite frankly, very few people who looked like me and a lot of people who were people of color and new immigrants to the country. And they were living in the neighborhoods that were most impacted. But they weren't the ones who could work at the steel. We called it the steel. Almost all of the jobs at the steel went to white men. And that disconnect between who had to bear the burdens of the pollution associated with this economically productive activity versus who got the benefits of it really shaped the way I think about the world. And I think that it really matters that we pay attention to who's in harm's way. And when we structure our decisions to protect those who are most vulnerable, I think we make better decisions overall, and everybody benefits.
And you know what? Again, I hear this often. The environment really shapes how you can understand things. And you saw the environment. You saw the racial injustice. You saw the poverty and the wealth injustice. You saw how the plant, for example, produces the pollution, but someone else is breathing in the air. And you saw all of this. And you know what? Make it global now, make that vision global. And really, that's what it is. I mean, the Northern Hemisphere, we're doing most of the polluting, and the Southern Hemisphere is doing most of the breathing that air in, and financially as well, and everything else. So in a way, I could say maybe you're destined to be where you are now by the upbringing that you had. Because, if you were in a beautiful beach town, an hour and a half north of LA, in a small community, you may not have perhaps seen this growing up, in the decades you grew up. So sometimes, you think about that.
But I mean, I agree with you, but the fact is that injustice is everywhere. Pollution is everywhere. Inequality is everywhere. And, if you look, you see it. And if you don't look, you don't see it. So I like to think that I would have seen a different manifestation of the same phenomenon had I grown up in a different place. I think a lot of it had to do with growing up in a family that was very oriented towards service. There's this concept in Judaism called tikkun olam, which is repairing the world. And that is the human duty to work with other people and to make the world a better place for everybody, not just for yourself, but for the people who are around you, who you may or may not know, who you may or may not have any specific relationship with.
Yep. And again, part of your upbringing, part of your environment, really, that's what really shapes us. And I often also say this to people. I don't find flaw in the principles of religions. I find flaw in the way that we've organized religion into an industry and a market. So what you just said about Judaism, you can find it in all Abrahamic religions. You can find it in Buddhism. You can find it in Hinduism. It's all over the place. And to think, about 80% of the world are somehow connected to one of these, you would think that everybody would act that way. But then somewhere along the line, we use the sentences, but we've lost the drive to live by that sentence and by those words. So I'm grateful you're doing that. You're still doing that.
Yeah, it amazes me that people use things that are supposed to be a moral grounding that make you love other people and care about the world that you live in, and turn it into a reason to hate other people, or if not hate them, to just think that they are somehow disposable or lesser or optional, as opposed to part of the community that we all are in, and it goes beyond the human as well to the rest of living things on this planet.
Definitely, the way we treat animals, the way we treat ecosystems in general. I mean, it's unacceptable. To be honest, I was having this conversation yesterday with someone, and I said, if there was an intelligent life that came to Earth and as a tourist walked around and left, and kind of intelligent in our way, in the way of understanding, things that we understand here from an ethical perspective, they would leave and think we're just psychotic at some level. We're just abnormal in some level, because we have all the education, all the books. I mean, I really find there isn't as much education as we have historically about ethics. I mean, morality and ethics, fills out our libraries. I mean, it's lesser with chemistry books or any other thing, even law. I mean, it's part of that morality and ethics. It fills our societies. Yet we find ourselves bankrupt. So it's a really difficult place to be right now.
Yeah. I think part of that is this shift, this mental shift we seem to have made from like citizen and community member to consumer. And so we look at the world as a series of things to be extracted and consumed and then discarded, as opposed to viewing ourselves as part of an ecosystem that exists independent of us and hopefully will exist for our children and their children and their children. And it's, yeah, I agree with you about a tourist. Do you ever read Gulliver's Travels?
Mm-hmm.
So, in it, there's this description of human beings as a species that has managed to manufacture wants out of nowhere and then spends all of its time trying to satisfy those wants through destruction. And it just is a very accurate observation about the kind of societies we've created.
Yeah. And you know what? Exactly to what you said, it isn't even, I see people sometimes, attacking capitalism or social systems or economic systems. And I say it's not even that, because if you even, we've been trading for a very long time. It didn't start with Adam Smith. We've been trading for a very, very long time. But even if you go to the modern economics of Adam Smith and The Wealth of Nations, he specifically says in there, enable people so that it benefits the whole.
Yeah.
That was the concept of capitalism, right? It was enable people so that they can bring those innovations and the betterment of whatever it is they're bringing to the table for the whole of society. Like you said, somewhere along those 200 years, we diverted into, kind of ruining all of that concept and just creating these wants that we try to satisfy that will be the end of us. Now, I want to ask you this. Speaking with you now, obviously, you speak on multiple branches and levels. And when I look at your publication breadth, it kind of mimics that. You have various styles. What inspires you to write a comic book series, a book on New York City history and places, and an academic book and a children's coloring book and so many different forms of, published works? Because I spent about a little over a decade in school. And I don't know one of my professors who has a book outside of the courses that they teach or related to really their core sector. So to meet somebody like you, very few people cross such boundaries, especially in academia, because it's very, it's a dogma of its own. So what happened?
Yeah, well, it was definitely a hard sell to be like, no, really, I want to make a comic book. And my colleagues were like, you want to do what? And then, oh, no, I want to make a coloring book. We made a coloring book about the census because that was happening during COVID. And we were trying to get the word out, particularly to hard to count communities, that it really mattered that they respond to the census, and two, that it was safe for them to do so, that even if they had immigration challenges or someone in their family did, that information would never be shared outside of the census. So it was a really important legal issue that we were trying to address in a fashion that would make sense for the receiving audience. And in fact, we partnered with mutual aid societies here in New York that were handing out food, and they gave out the coloring book along with the food. And we also made a short comic about the census. That
Maya's Lot, right?
Maya's Lot is an one of the Environmental Justice Chronicles. We made a much shorter comic about the census called You Count.
Yes.
It's just 3 pages.
I saw that too.
And the state assembly sent it out to like 50,000 families. So, it's really cool. Like through these projects, I've had a much, much larger reach than I would ever have for, underburdened communities, which is an article that I wrote that I'm very proud of. It's a scholarly article that I think makes really important points. But, maybe 100 people will read it. maybe a couple hundred if I'm lucky. And that matters because it matters to me to be part of that ongoing scholarly dialogue about what is the point of law and how do we shape policies designed under law to achieve goals in the wider society. But it also matters to me to be able to talk beyond that scholarly and policymaking circle to the people who live around me who will never pick up one of those articles, but live in an environment, they care about their children, they may or may not understand the links between air pollution from the power plants and the asthma that their children have. But I'd like to reach them with messages not only of understanding those links, but what to do about it and how they can participate in making decisions that will make their environment better for themselves and their children and their families.
I understand exactly where you're coming from in the scope of it and the breadth of it, because when I started Compassiviste, the podcast, the publishing house, and a few items, but then I thought, wait, this isn't reaching everybody because not everybody's reading books. So then, the music program came in, the film program came in, the TV program came in, and, the YouTube and all of that. And so many different arms, and the carbon labeling and the education and all of those things came together. And now we have like 15 different tentacles of the Compassiviste octopus, because exactly to what you say, you want to reach as many people as you can because it makes a difference. Staying with what you were just saying, can you please get into a little more detail about Census? Because it's something that I feel is important too, that people don't even know what it is, what's the purpose, what it does. And for a broader global audience, because there are sectors of our audience that don't even have this. So they don't understand the rationale. And I really want to bring it to discussion, at least for people to start understanding and talking and realizing why it's important. So give us a lesson. Census, what is it and why is it important?
So the census is a once a decade count of who lives where. And it is, on its most simple level, it is a collection of the number of people and their ages that live in any given place. Additional information is often collected about racial and ethnic background, education levels, economics, whether they own their home or they rent their home. All of that information allows decision makers at the state and federal level to make choices about funding. And in the United States in particular, there's a lot of formulas for funding in terms of schools and transportation and healthcare that are tied to population as identified in the census, as well as political representation. So every 10 years after the census, in the United States, we rejigger the House of Representatives, because as places gain or lose population, they might gain or lose representation in the federal government. Now, I also did some work in Colombia. Colombia has a census, and one of the struggles there is trying to capture the ethnic and racial makeup of the country. And until very recently, there was no way to capture the information of what percentage of the population was Afro-Colombian. And without that information, it's very difficult to make the case that the government should be paying special attention to pockets of poverty that are racialized, or to development that is displacing groups on the basis of race. If you don't have that basic information, you can't do the analyses that lead you to understanding environmental injustice that is based on race or ethnicity. So this baseline level is very, very important.
And what do you say to people? Because I say, I advocate for this kind of information gathering, right? And there are people who say, oh, it's an invasion of my privacy, or there's always this pushback against the census in some ways. And I don't ever hear at least I haven't yet heard a rational argument against it. So, what do you say about that? What do you say about people's worries about the census? Is it really conspiracy founded, so to speak?
What amazes me is the same people who are so concerned about giving their private information to the census are online, right? They're tracked by cookies all over the place. They have a social media account where they are sharing far more information and far more personal information. The information that the census collects is pretty basic, and it is very tightly controlled. It is a felony to disclose information that is personalized information that is collected about for the census. It is a felony punishable by hundreds of thousands of dollars and years in jail. So it is the most tightly protected information that you would ever give to anyone. It's far less
going to one organization, right? It's going to one
it
place.
goes only to
it's
the
not
census.
it's not like when you have a Facebook account and all of a sudden it's spread through God knows where and who and what.
Right. No one
parties,
is selling
right?
your census information.
Exactly.
And
Okay.
it is only being used in an aggregated, anonymized version to get a sense of who lives where. As a starting
Which helps
point,
us analyze, right?
Yeah.
Which helps us analyze all the things that people will need to have, less inequality, to kind of bridge the gaps, so to speak. You need the census. Otherwise, where are you coming up with the information to know who lives where in New York?
And like really basic things like, do we need another school? If you don't know how many kids there are, you don't know if you don't know if you're going to need another school in 5 years.
Right.
Does the hospital need additional beds? Does it need funding for
the
more
efficiency.
EMTs?
Right.
Without knowing the population, you don't know any of that, and so you're planning in the dark.
Yeah, you're estimating, inefficiently at best, and then the same people come out and worry about government spending and budgets and whatnot, and they're not willing to help essentially, perfect this and manage it. Now, you with these types of publications that you've kind of tried to reach a larger audience, and with Maya's Law and the other ones, you speak to something I like that you bring up is you speak to the Freedom of Information Act. And this is important for me because right now there is a lot, and when I say a lot, it's a very understated use of the word, disinformation that affects vulnerable Americans and people living in the USA in general, that is not only affecting the USA, but is affecting the globe. It really is affecting the globe. I mean, if you're looking at this from outside the United States, I'm in there, I'm out of there, I see it from both angles. It is really affecting the world. I mean, Canada right now, other countries, it's a mess, the disinformation that goes around and the comfort of spreading this disinformation, right? So the Freedom of Information Act, I mean, is it a loophole to just spread what we want because we have platforms that we can?
So
how do we defend?
The Freedom of Information Act is a little bit different from that. That is the right of any person, you don't have to be a citizen, any person to request information from the government, from the federal government, about federal government programs, the data that federal governments have collected, not census.
But that's what I'm talking about. Yeah. Right. That's your right to just receive information.
Right.
But the Freedom of Information Act is different.
So the Freedom of Information Act is only about your right to receive information from the federal government. The right to speak, right, to, the First Amendment right to speak and not have government sanction for your speech, is unfortunately not necessarily limited to speaking the truth.
That's fine, and I'm all for that. That's okay with me. But I'm specifically speaking about the government, because when you ask the government for information and the government gives you false information, where does that sit legally? So the Freedom of Information Act for me, I think about it that way, because what I'm talking about is specifically when your current president, for example, goes on the news and is giving information, and that information is not accurate by any stretch, what is the legal formation of this? Because that's what it is, isn't it?
Okay, so that again is not, the Freedom of Information Act is a very narrow thing. It is the right to request in writing from the government information upon which it has made decisions, information that it has collected. So that's really different than what somebody goes on TV and spouts.
Right.
Somebody goes on TV and spouts nonsense. Amendment.
That's a different.
You can use the Freedom of Information Act to get the underlying data and say, aha, you were lying. This is what you really know, and these are the decisions you really made for these reasons. It's not really. I mean, it's a very important tool for having some kind of democratic accountability. But if somebody wants to lie and somebody wants to misrepresent, then there's not a lot you can do about it. And if government agencies decide not to collect information, which I think is what we're seeing a lot of right now in the United States, just a decision of, we don't need information. We're making, we got vibes and that's all we need. That's a huge problem. Now, there are a lot of laws that require that information be gathered and tabulated, and and there've been a lot of court cases over the past month about sort of the failure to follow a lot of those laws. I don't know what's going to happen, because it's one thing to get a judge to say, or a panel of judges or the Supreme Court to say, yes, this is a law that was duly enacted by Congress and it is binding on the government, right? You have to do what the law says. But if the executive branch, if the president says, nah, what do you do at that point? Like, a legal system depends on everybody within the system agreeing that it's a legal system and that we are bound by law. If you have an executive who does not believe that he's bound by law, that's a profound constitutional crisis. And I don't know what's going to happen.
I mean, at this point, you're no longer talking about a democracy by the way we understand it, or a constitution or law. You're talking about just, a dictatorship of I do as I will, so to speak. At which point, the Freedom of Information Act doesn't matter, because what I was trying to get at is, why doesn't the public request this information, because they have the right to, and use this information to kind of say, hey, wait, government, this isn't accurate based on the research and the information that you have gathered, right? But if the government's not necessarily, held to the response and held to their actions, then what is the point of law?
That is the question we are asking ourselves right now. Now, I don't want to get all gloomy and depressive, because I believe that law is a profound structural cornerstone of our society. And, I think the reason people don't use the Freedom of Information Act more is that it seems very technical. It's like, if you look at the act, it's 5 USC, I don't remember the citation, but it doesn't matter. It's written in very technical language. And what we were trying to do in the comic book is to simplify it and make people understand that you can ask for information. You can always ask for information. And there are limits to what you're going to be provided. Like, they're not going to give you people's names and addresses and confidential information. But you can ask for information from your municipal government, from the state government, from the federal government, because there are laws at each level that require that this information be disclosed. The European Union actually has part of it, at least the part that's part of the Aarhus Convention, has an even more rigorous standard, where not only does the government have to provide you with information, but in some cases the government has to actually generate information in order to answer your questions. In the United States, the Freedom of Information Act only requires the government to provide information that it has. It doesn't require it to get new information or to collate information, only to turn over what information it has.
And I can tell you, in Europe, at least I find that people are more attuned and in touch with their governments in these formats. So they do request information. They do sit in and kind of understand what's going on politically and what's going on with decision making and how they've reached these decisions, which is why the laws have become so much more stringent, and they've grown over time in terms of, no, we need these layers additionally so that we can, respond to the masses demand. Whereas in the US, it seems to be that, rhetoric and narrative and storytelling wins with people. I mean, it's enough that you make people believe what you say versus people saying, okay, I heard what you say. Now, let me go and verify if this is the actual information based on all the gathering and all the time that was spent into this. So that doesn't help either. That kind of worries me a little bit. But like you said, be positive. And, I do also think the law is upheld for the most part as well. That is why it's not so scary, because, cities are not going into some, post-apocalyptic kind of sci-fi thing. So we're still seeing order, even in the disorder that's happening at a very high level in the world right now. We're seeing order enough that there is some kind of stability. So it scares me less. And staying with the law, I know you were on the Environmental Justice Advisory Board in New York, right? And I want to know one thing, because this interests me. Policy development and the lived experiences of the marginalized communities, people. Did you ever on that board, in that committee, have an idea or implement an idea on how to close that gap?
Yeah, well, that's the point of the Environmental Justice Advisory Board. We were created in 2017 based on a local law that City Council passed, requiring the city to engage in a self-study to understand what it was doing well and what it was doing poorly in terms of protecting the environment and protecting people who live in the environment in all parts of the city. And so to make sure that the city didn't just sort of have business as usual, the law required that they create the Environmental Justice Advisory Board, which includes community advocates and scholars like me and people who live in environmental justice communities, to be part of the board that was advising the city as it did this. And we have very specific roles in this process. So the city will they released a Environmental Justice for All report in the spring of 2024. Before they did that, they had a scoping process to try to figure out, well, what information do we need to look at in order to decide, in order to assess and write a report about the city? So we were involved in helping them identify what information to collect and look at. And it wasn't just us on the committee. Our job as the committee was to hold public hearings. It was COVID, so they were over Zoom, but we held public hearings that were translated into multiple languages to generate ideas from environmental justice communities about what are the kinds of things the city should be asking itself in order to understand environmental justice and injustice in New York City. And all of that information fed into how the city conducted the research that produced the plan. And then there were iterations within that where we were giving them feedback again about what variables they should emphasize, how they should do the analysis, what kinds of conclusions they should draw. And now that the plan has come out, now that the report has come out, the next step is to create a plan. Because the point of doing this self-study and this deep research and writing the report was to develop a plan moving forward for the city to better serve communities that are underserved and to understand where are the blocks and the barriers that are getting in the way of environmental equity, getting in the way of making sure that services are getting to the people who most need them and that communities are not being overburdened. So again, as we do that, we will be holding hearings in every borough. They will be translated into multiple languages. And the idea will be to get the lived experience of people on the ground into the policymaking at the early stages where we're saying, well, what are the questions? Rather than what so often happens, which is government will do a study and then they'll come to the public with the answers and say, here's the study we did, here are the answers, what do you think? And at that point, you can't really say, well, wait, you missed all this stuff. And if you'd asked us when you were creating the questions, you might have gone down different pathways. So that's the great advantage that I think right now public discourse is missing. The great advantage of diversity is that it makes you ask different questions. And when you ask different questions, you go down different pathways and you create different answers. And that's how you can have change, and that's how you can have progress. And that's how you build a society that's more just, more inclusive, and more, quite frankly, more prosperous.
And you're not standardizing, which is so important, because that's part of where all of the marginalized just fall off in that version. So, okay, I understand where you're going with that. That's great. And now, what is your version of the right to a healthy environment? What does that mean when I ask these questions, taking into consideration, what you're doing in that panel?
Yeah. So New York in 2022 amended the state constitution to add to the Bill of Rights an article that says that every person has the right to clean air, clean water, and a healthful environment. And right around the same time, the United Nations General Assembly recognized that the right to clean air, clean water, and a healthful environment are basic fundamental human rights. What does that mean? Is I think the one of the most interesting questions I'm working on. I actually just wrote an article that is called "Do I Have the Right to Breathe Clean Air?" that will be published. It probably won't be published until the fall, and it's sort of thinking about, well, if we say that people have the right to breathe air that is not going to make them sick, or drink water that is not going to make them sick, or live on land that is not contaminated, is not going to kill them, what does that look like? How does that filter back to a whole host of choices that get made about, road maintenance, about where we're going to generate electricity and what kind of, what kind of society are we going to have? And I think that's a great way to think about it, because again, it puts those who are most vulnerable at the center of decision making. Because some of us breathe clean air now, and some of us don't. And the line between who gets to breathe clean air and not have cardiopulmonary disease related to pollution versus those who don't get that is very much about economics, and it's very much about race, and it's very much about history, about how the government in the past made choices about where to locate polluting infrastructure, like power plants, and where to allow factories to, like the steel factory that in the town that I grew up in, where to allow them and where not to allow them, and where to build roads and which roads to build and whether to build roads or public transit. All of those choices, right, affect today. And embedded in each one of those choices is hundreds of very small decisions that will never, ever, ever make it into court. No one's ever going to sue and litigate over the hundreds and thousands of small decisions that are made on a daily basis. But if we change the orientation of those decision makers so that they see themselves as protecting the right to breathe, alongside protecting the right to property, which is also in the state constitution as a fundamental right, right? Those are both in the same part of the state constitution as fundamental rights. That's a really different way of thinking about one's job. And I think that like that's where we're going to see the most progress is in helping decision makers understand their role in either providing or undermining the right to a healthy environment as part of providing or undermining the good life and prosperity.
Okay, here's an example, and I'm going to stay with New York and New York City. If I were going to take what you said and think about where I should put the power plant to minimize health issues, I could say Montauk or Southampton. I mean, there's the least amount of population there. There is a lot of land, and it may just make sense to put it there, right? I mean, the geographical location also helps because the wind takes it downstream, and you don't pollute the city. But I really, really doubt that you're going to be able to allocate such land in such area for something like this. It's not going to happen. It will never happen. I can attest to that. But then I think, okay, what is a right really? Because the people who are going to end up with a power plant in their backyard are generally not going to be those people. You're never going to do it in those spaces. So how do you navigate that? I mean, how do you? What is the solution really? Because when you talk about you talked about the racial and the financial kind of primers of this, but racially it's easier to support a more inclusive and kind of move people around and make communities inclusive and shift people around. But when it comes to the financial divide, it is really difficult. I'm just thinking of many cities in my mind. It's really difficult to take, like you said, where do we do the roads and where do we put buses in, and where do we put our power plants in and all of that. It'll never happen in the most affluent neighborhoods of every city or state and country for that as well. I mean, I'm thinking Germany, UK, but some of the areas I'm thinking about in some cities, impossible. So does this really end up in a place where we can make change?
So I'm going to tell you a story. But
Okay.
First, I want to separate out two pieces. One of which is when and how we change the way that we generate energy so that it is less polluting. So that even when it is in the overburdened communities, it puts way less burden on them because we have changed the way we generate energy. That's one piece, but that's not the story I'm going to tell you.
No, that I agree with. I mean, we can improvise and we can improve our tech and we can really bring in the new stuff and spend the money on it, because right now we kind of don't. But if we did spend the money on installing the newest tech, yes, you may be able to 50-60% reduce the pollution, which that by itself is a great support for that area. It's huge. Yes.
It's not. It doesn't deal with that underlying imbalance in who's burdened, but by reducing those burdens, that's pretty significant. But I want to tell you a story about New York City, and it's a story not about energy generation, but about waste handling. So until very recently, New York City, I take a step back, New York City doesn't have any landfills anymore. Right. There used to be a landfill on Staten Island that was called Fresh Kills. It was closed. And New York City exports all of its waste. 12,000 tons of waste a day get exported from New York City to either upstate New York or to Pennsylvania or Virginia or Ohio for disposal. And that's an issue in and of itself. But I want to focus in more on New York City because I want to tell you a story.
A lot of it goes into the Ohio River. So that is an issue on its own.
There's so many issues. But yes, in New York City, right, all of that waste gets collected in municipal garbage trucks, right? There were the white trucks that you see driving on the street. And then it gets taken to waste transfer stations where it gets shifted onto, big box cars so that it can be either put on trucks or on barges. And until very recently, there were 3 communities in New York City that handled more than 75% of the waste. Not because they wanted to, but because they were poor communities, they were Black communities, they were communities without political influence. And when Fresh Kills was closed, the city had to create all of these waste transfer stations, and they all got concentrated. They're all privately owned, and they all got concentrated in these couple of communities. Those communities spent a long time organizing to document what an unfair burden this was on their communities, on the air quality, on the noise from all the trucks, as well as the safety on the streets, as well as the particulates and the stench from these waste transfer stations. And in about 15 years ago, the community organizing reached a crescendo, and they convinced the Department of Sanitation to create what was called a waste equity plan, which was a plan to even out how the waste was processed across the city so that each borough would manage its own waste. Because Manhattan wasn't managing any waste. It was sending it all to either Southeast Queens, North Brooklyn, or the Bronx. And then, right, through more community action, through building coalitions, through showing up at hearings, City Council in 2018 passed a waste equity bill, which required by law that the amount of waste going into these 3 communities be reduced significantly, like in half. So that meant there had to be more waste transfer stations in other places. And as part of the waste equity plan, one of them was cited for the Upper East Side, which is one of the wealthiest communities in New York City. And that community fought it like crazy, right? They actually fought it as an environmental justice issue, saying that we are being burdened because when you're used to privilege, something approaching equality feels like oppression. And they really tried to fight it they showed up at hearings and they were protesting and there was a lawsuit and they lost. And so there's now a waste transfer station on the Upper East Side of New York City. It's a marine waste transfer station. It puts, there are many fewer trucks because it puts the waste onto barges. So, you've got the local trucks coming in, but you don't have the long haul trucks, which are particularly polluting and particularly noisy and particularly dangerous. And guess what? First of all, it's the Taj Mahal of waste transfer stations. There's no odor. There's no particulate pollution, right? There's not even a lot of impact on the road. So that shows it's possible. So now those other communities can say, hey, we want that. Look, we know you can handle this waste without it being a burden on the community. We want that too. That's sort of one piece of it. And the other piece that I think is even more exciting is that as it became clear that this waste transfer station was going to happen and was going to be managing the waste of this community, the amount of waste the community generated plummeted. Because once they had to deal with their own waste, right, then generating less waste became a priority. So, yes, it's possible. Is it easy? No. But you can actually make change that spreads out these undesirable, we call them LULUs in environmental law. It's an acronym. It stands for locally undesirable land use, LULU. Right? When everybody's got some stake in the process because the garbage doesn't go away, right? Or the pollution, the electricity doesn't just come on through the wall. You can look out and see the plant. That changes the way people think about their consumption choices and also about what's worth paying for and what priorities matter. And that, I think, is how we build sort of structural change across society. And if it can happen in New York, it can happen anywhere.
If it can happen Upper East Side, it can happen anywhere. Yeah. And that's where the law comes in, right? I
Yeah.
mean, I'm glad you shared this story
Yeah.
because I know where you're talking about, and I didn't know the backstory. I just always, in my mind, thought, how stupid, because I thought they had all the power in the world there, right? I mean, you look at the property prices, and you think this is God's land, and you know, I always thought, why would they have allowed this, right? Not knowing that it was law, and it wasn't that they wanted it.
Hard fought, right? It was hard
Yes,
fought
yes,
for
yes,
equality. And, if
yeah.
you there's a running path that goes right by the waste transfer station because it's on
Hmm,
the East
hmm,
River in the Upper East Side.
hmm,
And nobody, unless they sort of are attuned to waste policy, has any idea that they're running past a waste transfer station because it is
hmm.
not the burden on the community that many other waste transfer stations are, which again shows that you can have these basic core services without them being a burden on the community if you care enough to make that happen, if you're willing to invest the money to make that happen.
And that's where I go back to the
Yeah.
original version of capitalism, the Adam Smith, right? I mean,
Mhm.
what happened there should happen in all the other boroughs, right? Because the tech is there,
Yep.
the innovation is there, the structure is there, the strategy is there, the planning is there, the organizing, everything is there because money was invested into making sure this doesn't exist. So when you run past it,
Yep.
like you said, on that track, you don't even know it's there unless somebody tells you it's there, right?
Right.
And so why is this not happening in the other spaces? Strictly because
Well, we're
we're
working on it.
misusing capitalism. But yes,
Yeah.
that's the beauty of it,
Yeah.
right? We're kind of coming full circle in a
Yeah.
way. And I think that full circle is also happening because I find recently a lot of the wealthiest people are coming out of that indifferent and aloof space where they were, unrecognizing how everything's affecting everybody in the world. They're starting to understand that just because I live in this space or in this area or far away from the city does not mean, for example, that the crime or the pollution or the other issues is not going to reach me as well. And that's kind of influenced people to become a part of how do we fix it
I hope
from
so.
all
I
areas.
hope so. I mean, I'm seeing a lot
I
of
mean,
really rich people who seem to think that the world is their playground. But
yes, yes, but you know
yeah.
what? Let me tell you something. I'll back what I said because I'll give you two quick examples. One, I'm meeting um, younger adults. I mean, early 20s, late 20s, early 30s, who are coming into huge trust funds, and I'm talking in the billions. Okay, they're reaching out to organizations like ours and saying, "I'm not comfortable," because they've grown more accustomed to the world. They're seeing the world from different lens. When I was a kid, you go to the boarding school I went to, and you don't see anything. All you see is an old castle that you grow up in with, like you said, privileged kids. That's it. That's all you know. You don't know the world, and then you get thrown into the world again. When I went to school, for example, in Toronto, I went to school that really had a lot of privileged kids going there. And a lot of them lived in the neighborhood that I lived in. And that was a privileged neighborhood. And we never talked about tuition costs, book costs. I mean, the professor would say, you need to buy these books. We'd go to the bookstore and buy them brand new. And these were
Right.
$100-something books. And I never really understood, any of these issues because that's the way I grew up. But then when I started going to different schools and kind of moving around and everything, I started seeing the inequality, even in education, how easy it is for me to write an essay because I have nothing to do other than sit in the library, put books in front of me, write that essay, and eat when I'm hungry comfortably, not questioning anything. Whereas another person has to manage two jobs and figure a time in between to write this essay without all the advantage. So it started there for me, right? The whole process of understanding inequality. And then as I grew up, I started seeing the portion of rich people because when I started my fund and it grew, I had those people as clients and there was no morality in them. I mean, none. There was no accountability of any kind of ethical standard in them. Even when they donated, even their huge charitable donations were accounted for in so many ways. A lot of wealthy families, I learned then in North America, a lot of wealthy families donate to hospitals because that gives you automatic first-person access when something happens to you. Your priority. It doesn't matter what else is happening in the hospital. You come in with a headache, that's the person who's funding us. We deal with their headache before anybody else. So, it was really not real. But now I'm seeing the kids are saying, no, I know where my granddad made this money. I know how it came to be. I know all the inequality and all the problems that it caused to today's society. I'm not comfortable continuing with this. I'm not going to, Fifth Avenue and shop with this money on Madison. And so, no, I'm going to give this money to maybe make a change. So I'm seeing that come in. And I'm seeing people who are making this, I call it intelligent income, where they're not putting in the hours, but they're intelligently have designed a way that they can maximize and generate a lot of money. And again, they're not using it in the traditional sense of, consumption and overconsumption. They are actually putting the funds to use in so many social programs that I'm beginning to see, some grassroots changes in the world from those two groups with funding, and which is allowing a lot of things like Just Stop Oil and Extinction Rebellion and all these other Global Citizen and all these groups to actually become these global groups, because they couldn't without the donations of people. And these are groups that those wealthiest people will not fund. I mean, you don't fund Global Citizen when the world is your
when
playground.
You're their target. Yeah.
Yes, you see what I mean? But who is funding them? Because they have hundreds of millions of dollars in funding. They don't have $20,000 in funding. That's grassroots operation. When you say, Global Citizen as an organization, they have a deal going on with FIFA for next year's World Cup in New York for the final. They're hosting that halftime show and everything else. So it's a huge organization with huge money. Who's funding these, tens of millions? Well, guess what? It's those kids. It's those people who can write $1 million check because they feel obliged in some way to do that, and they want to cut off from that kind of privilege and have a different kind of privilege of saying, I'm privileged to live in a society where there is law, where there is equality, where there is that sense. And you're one of those people. I mean, I'm not going to sit here and kid myself. You're a professor. You're in New York. You're teaching at one of the best schools. You're established. You're not hungry. You're not fetching for your next meals. But instead of taking that money and being like those people, you're actually investing your time and money into all these social causes, whether it's writing or advocating or empowering people with education. So you see, when people like you happen at the academic level and people like the children grow up with the education that you are putting into them and people like yourselves are putting into them, the world starts to change. We just need the collectives now to actually make those changes powerful. I mean, when you're telling that story about waste management, the boroughs that were poor had to somehow come together and raise some funding and bring some of the lawyers who live there and say, guys, you need to really step to the plate here. Something happened for them to win, right? I mean, that's what it's about. It's about building that collective to come together. And I think we really need to do that now because we're in this dangerous space, kind of like when we study history. I'm sure I know you have a background in biology, but I know you like history too. And sometimes when you read history and you're thinking, God, why didn't they do something there and then? Because this was going to happen. You could just see that moment where you're like, that is, that moment, Hitler. No, why did nobody, why did it have to happen this way? Why do you let it stretch? And I feel like we're in that space right now where 100 years from now, people are going to look and say, oh my God, Rebecca, like, why didn't you, or whoever it is, why didn't you? And I keep telling people, we got to catch ourselves in those moments. We got to say, no. We're that moment that we, our teachers in school or when we read history, we're like, that's the moment that everything went off the rails, And so, what do you say to that? I mean, how do you raise that? How do you change that? Because like you say, if it happens in New York, it can happen everywhere else, because I know the New York vibe. It's a difficult place to kind of get things going, because there's just so much pull from every section and direction.
Yeah, well, I think going back to that idea of the sort of the shift from citizen and community member to consumer, I think people have. I mean, life is hard. Like, people are busy. Like, I totally get that. I mean, I'm very privileged to be able to do this work, and I every day I like am so excited that I get to do this work. That's a privilege in and of itself. But when people understand themselves as actors, as subjects, not as objects, not as to be acted upon, but as to be the actor. And that's what we try to do with Maya's Lot. We go into schools here in New York City, and people use it around the country and actually across the world, to work with young people to help them see themselves as actors with power, people who can call on elected officials and ask for things and demand things and tell them about problems and ask for solutions. That's where we get change, is when people see themselves as entitled to ask for change and important part of asking for change, and not somebody else is going to fix this, not I'm going to complain about it on social media, but hey, I think I can make this better. And in making something better in the world, I make my life better. I feel better about myself. I have connections that I didn't have to people that I didn't know. My world is bigger. My networks are stronger. And, that benefits not me and the community. And I think that can get lost in the day-to-day grind, especially when so much of success is measured by how much money do you have, or how many things do you have, and how many things do you need? I don't, I think that a reorientation, I think that is happening, because when we didn't have a lot of possessions, getting more things made life better or created joy. But at this point, I mean, things are really, for many people, are just a burden. It's like, oh, and I got to figure out where to put this, and and now my house is even more cluttered. And
I mean, thank you for saying that. The fact that you use the word clutter, that it should be in our vocabulary itself, is dangerous, because I know what you're talking about. People come home and like, I bought this, I love it, but where am I going to put it? And then they stress about it. And I'm like, how do we get here? How do we get to a place where clutter is a word that we use, right? And you open any home gardening, interior design magazine or anything, and there's always an article about how to declutter.
Yeah.
And you're thinking, how many people are over-consuming consistently in ways that they absolutely don't need to, that we have a clutter issue? I mean, we have a wardrobe
don't even
problem.
realize they're doing, because the default is just get one. I live in a high-rise apartment building in New York City, and we have this really cool group of people who live here, and we've gotten to know each other pretty well. It's very much a community, and we all joke that we just keep things stored in everybody else's apartment. Because, if you live in a high-rise building, does everybody need a hammer drill? I mean, you need access to one, but you don't need more than that. So, we have so many things like that, like wetbacks or serving platters, or I'm trying to think of children's toys. Children's toys just get passed around because, your kid is a baby and they need baby things, but then they're not a baby anymore. And what do you do with the stuff? If you live in a New York City apartment, you're not keeping it, but you pass it on to the next person. And the amount of stuff that we consume as a group has plummeted because we're sharing. And it's not official, it's not like any kind of a structure. It's a community.
But thank you for sharing that, because I'm thinking what you say is just genius. Instead of all the high rises having a meeting room, party room, blah blah blah, theater room, all those things at the bottom, why not allocate a space for common usage room where, like you said, the hammer drill that you'll use twice in your lifetime, that maybe in a high rise there's 20 of because everybody went and bought their own. Let's buy one collectively and put it there, and there can be a collective building fund or something that kind of
even if there's not, it's like, okay, you have the hammer drill, but I have the I don't know what the other thing, and we just trade off and on. And so before I buy anything, I say, hey, does somebody have a fill in the blank, whatever the thing is. One of my neighbors was like, anybody have size 9 black shoes? Because my kid is going to an event and needs black shoes, and it seems silly to buy him shoes he's going to wear once. So probably somebody has them, and we'll lend them to him, and he'll wear them, and it's less makes life less expensive, but it also generates far less waste, because if they bought that 16-year-old that pair of shoes that he didn't want but needed for
and then by the time they're 18 they can't wear it anyways because they're size 11
and
now.
Would never wear it because he didn't want it in the first place. It would just get maybe it would get donated, probably it would get thrown out.
And you know what, Rebecca, it brings people together too, because now whoever's giving you those shoes is asking about the event, knows a little more about you. Where did you go wearing them? The story that gets told. And, through these storytellings, we feel connected. And that person becomes Uncle so-and-so, right? And then we get this community feeling, and then it reduces crime as well, because, you're
and
just
when there's a crisis,
less likely
you have
come together.
Neighbors, right? You don't have just people that you're living next to, you have a community. So when somebody is sick, like one of my other neighbors just had major surgery, and people are walking their dog for them, people are buying their food for them for while people were cooking, right? And these are not economic transactions. This is part of being in a community and knowing that when you help somebody, that makes the community stronger, and when you need help, they'll be there for you too.
I want to tie what you just said to Naming Gotham, your book, because I feel like what you're talking about here, you go into the historical narratives of some of the urban identities in New York right now, and community dynamics and stuff, and the namings of them. I mean, the way, Dumbo transformed essentially, or some other district. Did you sense any of this like cultural identity and formation when you're doing the name checking and how it happened and the history and all of that in the book?
Yeah, it's actually part of why
because that was really I actually read that because it's really fascinating, because I'm like, I didn't know that's why, and then I'm telling everybody I know in New York, and they're like, really? Did you check that? I said, yes, it's in this book.
Well, thank you.
So tell me about that.
So my parents they still live in Pennsylvania, in the steel town I grew up in, or near it anyway. And you can't get there on public transportation, which drives me crazy. But it means that when I go visit them, I have to drive. And I would always drive to get out of New York City from Queens. The easiest way usually is to take the George Washington Bridge. And there are two ways to get to the George Washington Bridge from where I live. You can either take the Major Deegan Expressway, or you can take FDR Drive. Now, everybody knows who FDR is. Everybody knows who George Washington is. Nobody had a clue who Major Deegan was. And yet, this really important road is named after him, right? It goes by Yankee Stadium. It connects to the George Washington Bridge. And it's a terrible road. If you take it, you're stuck in traffic. And so I would sit there, and I don't like to drive in the first place. And I so frustrated that I have to drive to get to my parents' house. So I love my parents, so I do it. And I didn't like being in traffic, and I would get really mad. And I would be like, who was this Major Deegan? I hate him. Nobody had a clue who the guy was. And my family eventually got sick of hearing me say that. And they were like, well, why don't you find out who he was? So I did. And it turned out that he's way less impressive than you might think, given that he has this road named after him, and this really important road in New York City. And but he was really interesting. And it got me interested in who else did we name things after, and why were they the people we named things after? And you see how much of it is about power and about connection and about influence, and how that is how the people who are in those spots of power and influence and connection are changing as the city changes, as the city becomes, less rigid in its social and class hierarchies. And as new groups and new communities gain power, you see a change in who are the people that things get named after. And that to me is really interesting, because that is the story of sort of identity. And, the story of the layers over time of how a place gets built and becomes a community and becomes a place like New York City, that I'm on all these groups of people coming to New York City, and people want to come here from around the world. Why? Because it's such a melting pot, because it's a place where whoever you are, whatever language you speak, whoever you love, there's room for you here, right? And no one's even going to notice you. And that like blessing of anonymity of like, oh, I'm 6'3" and trans and I don't know what else, and like no one's going to pay the slightest bit of attention to you as you walk down the street, because it's a big city. We always say, well, if you're 1 in a million, there's 7 of you here.
True. I've heard that. And it's, this is the story.
Yeah.
To me, the book kind of was also a story of inclusive evolution.
Yeah.
Because that's what, when you tell that story, that goes through my head in the book, because it's kind of like, it started with this, elitist conception, and then it became this evolution of inclusivity. As you said, the structures change and everything grew to that. It was really nice. I will tell everybody listening, watching here to read that book. It's really
fun. It was so fun.
Even if it's not, I'm sure it was, because you're continuously learning, it was so educational. Even if you're not from New York, it's fun because you kind of understand that and you can place it in your own town. Because, when I compare that to, places that I know well, London, Toronto, Paris, other cities, I'm like, oh, I could see this book. You know what? I'm going to tell her series time, because you could do this for every city, right? You could kind of create a space where people can come in and do this for every city. It'll be really fascinating.
People have said that, but I sort of feel like it was a labor of love for me to write about New York.
Yeah.
I think it's something that people should do about the place that they live. And one of my
franchise
great hopes. See,
that's what you should do.
Yeah.
Not for the money. I mean, franchise it as an idea so that you can kind of guide
for New York kind of thing. Yeah.
This way you can kind of guide people doing it for their own cities, and then all these educational insights flare up when we do this.
My hope is that people reading it will walk down the street and say, "Oh, I wonder who this is named after. Who was this?"
I know. I know. I do that now. I do that to my friends. I'm like, you walk by such and such building every day, right? I'm like, question. Do you know, and then like, no, nobody knows. I'm like, no, I know, and then, and then it becomes a whole conversation. And then, then it becomes arguments. but it also becomes arguments, because they're like, I can't believe they named it after that person, because then they go into the history of the person, like, oh my God, and sometimes it's like, oh, what a wonderful person. So it creates a lot of conversation as well. So it's great. Last question for you, Rebecca. Challenges. What keeps you up at night in your field in terms of justice, environmental law, the power of law in today America in general, and on a broader scale? Because we spoke a lot about the state of New York, but I can also say the state of New York is very influential to other states. Not just in that East Coast column, but even going slightly west, and even affecting the West Coast in a way, because of the trade, because of the money management, because of a lot of integrations between New York and Texas, for example, and New York and California. What do you worry about, and what do you want people to be vigilant about?
Yeah. I worry. I'm up a lot in the middle of the night right now. I'm really deeply concerned by the rise in an ideology of me, the rise in people who think that somebody else's success harms them, as opposed to making everything better for everybody. There seems to be this zero sum grievance based politics that looks at me and says, oh, well, she only got her job because she's a woman, as opposed to, the years of hard work that I put in and the extra barriers that I had to face because I was a woman, because, people called me honey, or students looked at me and said, I want a real teacher. And when I started out, that was a long time ago. But
you went through that. I'm thank you for saying that, because
yeah.
I want people to hear that. People did say that to you, and that's important, because there are women right now who are starting out.
Yeah.
And it really bothers me. And Compassiviste is a feminist movement, not specifically for the equal pay cause, but the E at the end of Compassiviste, because when you put compassion and action together, I mean, it stops at the T. There's no reason for the E, but the E comes from you take some of the languages like French and Spanish and Arabic and whatnot. They have feminine and masculine in the sentence structures and words and all of that, and a lot of older languages do.
Mm-hmm.
And to me, the root of feminism is touching on what you said. Caring, because that's what a mother does. I mean, a mother, whether it's Mother Nature giving us the world and our food and our fruits and our vegetation and everything else naturally, or whether it's a mother naturally giving birth and taking care of the child, or the cycle of all of that happening, is the root of feminism. So if you can't care about those things, you can't really come to me and say, I'm a feminist, and I look at your life and all you're doing is doing everything anti-feminist in that way of caring for the environment and society and your community and everything else. But you're going to court and fighting somebody's, pay equality for a fee as a lawyer, and you're getting paid for it. You're not a feminist. That's for the money that you're getting paid. Feminism is deeply rooted in how you look at the world, how you transact with the world, essentially, and always making sure that you're doing it with that motherly approach that cares for a better future, and that's the root. So when you say something like, your student said that to you early on, I'm thinking to a 20-something Rebecca, and how difficult that is to even get over. I mean, you would laugh about it now because you're so far advanced and so confident in yourself right now that it's laughable. But a lot of young women, they're suffering through this, and we still do it.
Yeah. Oh, absolutely.
Sorry
And
about the rant, but
no,
it gets to me.
Especially right now. And and it's not just women, it's also people of color. I mean, the idea that somebody could look at some of my colleagues and think anything other than, wow, that is an impressive person, just blows my mind. And we're seeing this movement in the United States of assuming that the only people who have whatever counts as merit are white and are men. And which doesn't mean that there aren't a lot of really smart and really talented
Mm-hmm.
white men. There are,
Mm-hmm.
but there are a lot of really smart and really talented people, period. And the idea that to acknowledge the talents of somebody because it is only done because they're a woman or only done because they're Black is not only insulting, but it's so contrary to the hurdles that people have to overcome in order to be taken seriously in a world where white and male is the default.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm sorry, now I'm ranting, but I think
no,
that's
you're right.
this
You're right.
notion of
and you would think that we passed it, right? You would think that
yeah.
you read history and you look at Marie Curie and you think, okay, because her husband was her shield, kind of pushing all their studies and everything under his label, that all these things happen, and you think, okay, that was old times. I can understand that, whatever. And then you come to today and you're like, well, centuries have passed. Where are we? And you find you're in the worst place.
Yeah, and all of a sudden they're covering up pictures of women in, federal museums or covering up pictures of people of color because, we don't want to acknowledge that they had talent. That to me is infuriating. And it's this vision, it's embedded in this vision of masculinity and manhood that is, I think, really toxic. And, you were talking about feminism and the feminine idea of connection, but I think that's a human idea. And I think that, men are deeply rooted in caring for their families and caring for their communities. And somehow right now in the popular media, this idea of manhood is like hurting and attacking as opposed to something that is supporting and protecting and nurturing. And I that keeps me up at night. That and the fact that the changing climate are my biggest worries. And they're not unrelated.
No, they're not at all unrelated, because the decisions we make come from exactly those people that you're talking about. That toxic masculinity, so to speak, on that scale, and it connects. I mean, if we can resolve, which is why I've taken up so much to tell people there's a lot of lovely scientists doing the science on environmental issues. There's a lot of amazing lawyers doing the legal stuff that needs to be done. But there is a shortage of people who are trying to tie the environmental issue to the social issue, because it is not an environmental issue, is not this itself issue. Allergies are a compartmentalized issue. I mean, your child has peanut allergies, you do certain things to make sure that they don't get hurt or die or something, and they're isolated things that you do. They're not tied into the whole social aspect of things in a way. But a deteriorating climate, you can't compartmentalize it to solutions. You can't take a pill for it or offset or stuff like that and turn it into some market and make business out of it and hope that it goes away. And,
or think that you won't be impacted. That
yeah,
only
because when immigration, you look at the refugees and the immigrations and climate refugees specifically. I mean, we didn't have the concept of climate refugees 50 years ago.
Yeah.
Today, there's over 200 million people who have to move. And when you ask, why do you have to move? It's not, oh, I'm looking for a better job, or no, it's because my house is now a lake because there was a flood, so I have to move, right? Or my agricultural land is now arid and I have to move. So what are you going to do with these people? How many of these people are you going to plant in London or in New York and think that it's going to be fine, and think, like you said, that you're not going to get affected? Eventually, no city can sustain the population of the world, no matter how advanced it is today. So if we don't fix those social issues.
Yeah. And, the part of North Carolina that flooded last fall was a place where people thought, oh, there's going to be climate in-migration because that's a safe place. There is no safe place. We are doing this to the planet as a whole, and no amount of I have my bunker and I have my money is going to protect you in the end. We have to.
It did it in Palisades.
Yeah,
that was an area where that kind of people live. Where you can have a bunker and you can have security and safety.
Yeah.
And even if you're filthy rich and you had homes all across the U.S. or anywhere else, or you decided, we're going to just go on a family vacation to, Disney in Paris while our house is burning down, regardless, you had to feel the wrath of that happening.
Fire still comes.
Right. You can't avoid that. Your house is still going to burn. So if you rationalize this in its continuity and think, if this happens to every one of my houses over the next 5 years, then what? Right. Yeah. So we're reaching that kind of rationale where we're starting to think this is a social problem. We all need to come together and try to see what we can do. So I hope we will, because that's all we can do. We do what we do. I mean, you're doing your part. Everybody's doing their part as much as possible. Not everybody, but I mean, a majority of people are. I hope the people who are super influential start doing their part, because if they do, then we see a shift. Just like I know people in the world who, if they start wearing a blue t-shirt tomorrow, the color blue becomes the it color and it gets sold out everywhere in the world. In that same capacity, why can't you influence this?
Yeah.
Right? So we're hoping together. Rebecca, thank you very much for speaking on Compassiviste Dialogues, and thank you for sharing your insights and experiences from the books, from the comics, from everything you're doing legally, the work you're doing in the panels, and the education. It's a lot. So thank you for your dedication to integrating environmental justice into various forms of expression that not only educates the masses, because there isn't a lot of that in the world. There's a lot of education in academia for people who are at those master's and PhD levels who can grasp that technical information. But thank you for bringing it to the masses and inspiring action, because what I was chasing you mostly for, bringing you to the show, was really the inspiration. What you're doing is activating people. You're not just telling a story. Like you said, you're not just doing the social media bit, you're actually activating people. And that's what I want people to do in the world. Activate, change, act, because it's through that momentum, through that action, that we will see change. So I really like that you're doing it that way. Thank you.
Well, thank you so much. Can I just say to anybody who's listening that if you want to see the Environmental Justice Chronicles, it is available for free download from my website for any nonprofit or educational purpose. So, if you use it, let me know, because I like to keep track of it. But feel free to read them, feel free to download them, and use them in your community in ways that make sense to you.
You beat me to it, because I was just going to say, it's okay, but I was just going to say, guys, guess what? You can actually access everything she's doing. It's not like, she's published them through HarperCollins or Random House and they're like $150. And no, it's all accessible. It's all there. It's all, I was kind of like, whoa, this is a person who's putting, doing the work, actually, because I was at the beginning expecting you to be another academic using your academic power in publishing to kind of put these works out, and then teaching a course where you force your students to buy all of those things. And, it's normal to see that. I'm sorry, but it's normal to see that. And when I saw the reverse, I was like, ooh, that's an activist right there. That's a model where academia should follow, because that is how change happens. So that was my next little bit about you, but you beat me to it. And yes, we are going to put all the links for everything you just said and everything you're doing down there in the information. So please check everything out about Rebecca. She's an activist, and that's how it should be done. All links to Rebecca Bratspies and Compassiviste are listed below, so check them out. We're here to help change the world together. I'm Ali Horiat.